It's welcome day for Kevin Warsh. It's Wednesday, June 17th, and this is Markets with Megan. If you like this podcast, you can subscribe to it. There's an alarm bell you can hit. Also, feel free to share this with your friends, family, neighbors, colleagues, anybody who really likes to delve into the economic data and what it means on a regular basis for moving these markets. Well, today we welcomed Kevin Warsh as the Federal Reserve Chairman, and he came out with a meeting that was quite different than we've seen in past Federal Reserve chairmen. Let's break down what we got. Now, it was widely expected that we would see no changes in rates, and we did not. They left rates unchanged. It was a unanimous decision, 12-0. We've had some dissenters on the committee in the past few meetings, so this was welcome news to see some unification here in the committee. That was also as expected. The dot plots, there were actually 9 officials that see at least one rate hike here over the next 12 months, and some pricing in 2. Warsh did not release dot plots, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But they also did remove the easing bias, which was expected given the recent hike we've seen in inflation. The statement was much shorter than we've seen compared to past chairmen, and we'll also discuss that in a moment. But let's talk about the biggest move on their economic projections, and that was on inflation. So for 2026, they're expecting core inflation around 3.3%. That's up from 2.7% at the prior meeting. For 2027, they expected at 2.5%, and that's up from 2.2% at the prior meeting. So this is definitely a hawkish tilt to this meeting and the statement that came out. This is the Fed's. Remember, their target inflation rate is about 2%. So they're not talking about inflation reaching that target until at least 2027. And in fact, it's not supposed to get there even in 2028 with these initial forecasts. Now, why do we want to kind of delve in a little bit about some of these things I mentioned, like the shorter statement and the dot plots? It's because Kevin Warsh has been very critical about over communication by the Fed. It creates way too much instability in the markets. It also, with regular releases of dot plots, this has Fed officials sometimes holding on to their estimates longer than they really should have. So he wants to give these members more flexibility to change as the economic picture changes. So he did make it very clear that they can and should produce their own dot plots, but he will not be. He did come out with a task force. Now, this is important because it's going to focus on 5 things. Communications. I mentioned their statement this time was much shorter than prior chairmen's. They want to be clear, succinct, and to the point with what their comments are coming out of this meeting. There'll be a task force to look over the communications of the different Federal Reserve officials. The balance sheet. Obviously, the balance sheet is extraordinarily large. Kevin Warsh was very critical when he did serve on the Federal Reserve back during the financial crisis, that the balance sheet should not be used. And we're still sitting here with a balance sheet that looks like we're in an emergency type of monetary policy situation, which we are not. He also is going to have a task force on the data, really the methodology around what data points that we use. He's going to have one on productivity and jobs. Remember, there's a dual mandate by the Fed, price stability and full employment. Well, with the change with AI and new technology, he wants to make sure that we're addressing the appropriate labor market measures and that we're balancing that full employment with price stability. Also, a Fed task force on inflation frameworks. So there's a lot of concern around the different measures that are being used by the Federal Reserve, and are they really showing the true inflation picture? Kevin Warsh has often favored what's called a trimmed PCE inflation, which takes out a lot of noise around inflation and can sometimes smooth out those geopolitical and supply shocks like we're seeing as a result of the Iran war. However, there's a lot to be seen about this. He's hoping these task forces, his goal is to have them up and running with details out by the end of this year. So we'll get more. I don't know we'll get it at every Fed meeting because he's made it clear that these communications should be simply about monetary policy, but we'll keep our eye on it. We aren't really in favor of them changing too much on the inflation framework because as quickly as that can look in favor to a Fed where they're getting closer to their target. It can look in the opposite direction. So we just want to be careful on, monitoring how they do that and keeping our eye on that. Now, the markets have been kind of all over the place. They were down big when the statement came out because it was much more hawkish. They've settled back in relatively unchanged. I'm not sure when I go back to my desk what we'll be seeing. Bond yields were weaker, meaning they rose because basically Fed cuts are priced completely off the table for this year. So those people that still had rate cuts priced into the market, which I don't understand why, it's off the table as of right now. But we'll be back with some more information. Right now, that's all we've gotten out of the Fed with the new Federal Reserve Chairman. Good to see some new face in there, and it's always good to get a fresh eyes on how monetary policy is conducted. If you want a history of our podcast, you can go to marketswithmegan.fm. Thank you.